Doing reviews on this channel serves two main purposes for myself. For a large percentage of these games that are sitting behind me, playing and reviewing them is my first exposure to the game. So it's a nice new experience even when the game is bad. And for the games that I've heard of before but never played, the review is serving to sort of fill in the blanks and let me know what I might have missed out on when the game was originally released, most of the time over 30 years ago. But then there's another category of games, and those are the titles that I did play back in the day, some more than others. Doing these reviews allows me to refresh my memory and remind myself of why I did or did not like the game back in the day. Along those same lines though, I'm not the same person at 45 that I was at 15, so playing these games is sometimes revelatory for another reason, because there's always the possibility that even though I loved or hated a game 30 years ago, maybe, just maybe, I'm either misremembering what I liked about it, or I'm realizing that I didn't give the game a fair chance when I was younger, and it's actually better than I remember. Imagine that, me being wrong about something. I mean, that never happens. These videos are always perfect, right? However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me, and even though you don't know me, you now know that I'm full of crap based on that last statement. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm reminded every single week that in doing these videos of how little I actually know, and how much I've forgotten. You see, I'm old. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. The reason for all of this discussion about me questioning my memory and, well, my sanity is this week's game, Sports Talk Baseball, a game that I have very fond memories of playing before Sega transitioned to the World Series Baseball series of games, which are also titles that I like very much as well. Sports Talk Baseball was released in May of 1992 exclusively in the United States, but in that exclusivity, much like the steroid-era player stats, there's a large asterisk beside it because technically Sports Talk Baseball was based on the Japanese game Pro Yaku Super League 91, which is the same game minus the sports talk and featuring Nippon professional baseball teams instead of teams based around Major League Baseball. This makes for Sports Talk Baseball to be a true sequel to the game that I reviewed back in episode 56, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, because Tommy Lasorda Baseball was in turn based on Super League. I know Sports Talk isn't for everyone, and there's some people out there that don't appreciate the robotic announcing present in this game and the Joe Montana football games, but personally, I'm a fan, and I just remember that for when this game came out, there was nothing else like it on the market. So, with the Sports Talk feature and rosters made up of real MLB players from the 1991 season, and the ability to actually play a full 162-game season with playoffs, there was tons to like here. But was everything really that rosy in Sports Talk Baseball, or were maybe there's some issues that I'm not remembering? Well, we'll take a look and put this to bed once and for all, but first, a look at the package. And here's my copy of Sports Talk Baseball, and unlike last week when I reviewed a game that I had just purchased in Growl, I have no clue when I picked this one up. I'm going to assume that it was relatively early on in my collecting due to my fond memories of the game as a kid, but it's definitely been long enough that I don't remember where or when I got it. Along those lines, I could have picked it up almost anywhere, as it's not exactly a rare title, but it does go for slightly more than your average sports game from the era, usually selling anywhere from $5 to $20, depending on condition and if it contains a certain stat sheet. More on that in a minute. This particular copy is in decent shape. It's not perfect. There's a little ding at the top of the front cover, but it could be way worse, as there's no sun bleaching, water damage, or edge wear to the inner cover, and the hang tab is intact at the top. And it's also more complete than your average game, which might sound a little confusing, but it will make sense when we open it up, so I'm more than happy to just hold on to this copy and not replace it. As far as that front cover art goes, I think this is a solid look, utilizing a photo of in-game action for the majority of the art, as a lot of sports titles do, and then the very clean logo at the bottom, all written in block text and using red and blue as to match up with the MLBPA logo. Also, I like the old school microphone it's thrown in as a tip to the sports talk announcer that's included with the game, and of course that's mentioned also via the live play-by-play symbol that's tucked neatly into the side up here. I also appreciate that they were able to mention the 500 players using 1991 stats at the bottom. Very small, so not distracting, but still just enough to let you know what was included in the game. All around, I think it's an iconic cover in the Genesis library. Although it's funny, for years I assumed that the athlete on the cover was Rickey Henderson, due to the green helmet and gloves, but now after actually looking closely for this review, I think that's actually Kevin Moss, who was the designated hitter for the Yankees that year, and Sega just colored the helmet and gloves to not run afoul of licensing issues, as the game only features MLBPA licensing and not MLB licensing. More on that in the review section. But if anyone definitely knows who it is, drop a comment down below, as I wasn't able to find anything via the Googles when doing research for the video. Just as a quick note, as mentioned, this game was only released in the United States, so there's technically no alternate covers to compare it to. But here is the Japanese game that it's based off of, Pro Yaku Super League 91, and yeah, I'm not a fan of this one. I think they were better off with the original Super League cover, so I'm happy with what we got for Sports Talk Baseball. Flipping over the back, and I'm not going to go over too much here, but I will say that the flavor text describing the game is decent, but it definitely relies on a lot of name drops for stars. I'm assuming to try to maybe catch people's attention by mentioning their favorite player. However, one thing I do have to give them credit for, I like this screenshot section, how it has individual pictures of different batters showing their specific swing style. It's a nice touch to the game, as clearly not everyone swings the same way in real life. Opening up the package, and here's what I was referring to before when I said it was more complete than usual, because with Sports Talk Baseball, not only did you get a manual, but you also get this double-sided roster poster, which was clearly created on a Macintosh due to the fonts that they used. This is something that I really wish all games at the time came with, so that you could just know at a glance who was on each team and what stats they had, to help you choose who you want to play as. And I'm totally okay with it not necessarily being in the manual, but it does mean that it's something else that collectors have to keep up with. As far as the manual goes, it's a very thorough explanation of how to play what's actually a relatively simple game of baseball, to the point that I can't think of a single thing that they could have covered that was left out. And there's even a diagram of a baseball field right in the center for people that clearly have never seen baseball before. Okay, that's the package. Let's swing for the fences and hopefully not come up short at the warning track. I mentioned earlier that I had a strong fondness of this game growing up, and that was for a number of reasons. One of those is somewhat selfish, but I grew up a Chicago Cubs fan despite being located 800 miles away, which caused all sorts of annoyance from my dad, who couldn't comprehend why I didn't root for the Atlanta Braves. To me, that was easy. Along with having the great Harry Carey announcing in the booth, the Cubs had my favorite player, Andre Dawson. While I liked Tommy Lasorda baseball for what it was, being able to play Sports Talk Baseball with its rosters made up of real MLBPA players based on the results of the 1991 season, it allowed me to really play as my favorite team, minus that pesky Cubs logo. That is something that I should mention, and I don't necessarily mean this to detract from the game, but for players picking up the game, while Sports Talk Baseball does feature real athletes, it does not feature real team names and logos, leading to having games just be played as, say, Cincinnati versus St. Louis, rather than the Reds versus the Cardinals. Just don't look too closely at that logo for Pittsburgh, or St. Louis for that matter, because while it wasn't specifically ripping off the Pirates' name, it's definitely running up to that line where lawyers were at least in the room discussing things. Baseball fans would have to wait almost 2 more years until the release of World Series Baseball to get both MLBPA and MLB licensing included in the same game, So for now, just the real players would have to do, and honestly that was okay because with having real players, it was easy enough to pretend that you were actually playing games that were taking place in the friendly confines of Wrigley Field, or perhaps stadiums in other cities around the league. Although that does bring me to the next thing about this game that doesn't quite line up with real life, and that's the stadiums included in the game, or lack thereof. Along with a game not having real team names and players, not having their individual team stadiums also causes games to lose some realism points, because the one thing that really makes going to a Major League Baseball game special is that every stadium is built a little differently, as opposed to other sports where the fields or courts are always exactly the same. And I want to be clear, for when Sports Talk Baseball came out, the norm was that everyone played in the same generic baseball stadium, so Sports Talk Baseball not having customized stadiums isn't that big a disappointment because no one had done it yet, and it wouldn't be until RBI Baseball 4 came out 4 months later that anyone had even attempted it on the Genesis. To Sega's credit though, they did include 3 stadium choices for players, with each being based around a type of field, and that's more than what anyone else was doing at the time, and allowed players to at least choose a field that resembled where their favorite team played. Now that we've talked a bit about who you can play as and where you can play, what is there to do when you actually boot up the game? Well, there's 3 main game modes. There's an exhibition mode, which can either be you against the computer or a second player, and if you do choose to play in 2-player mode, you get to play a 5-game series against that player. If you want, of course. You could always just play the one game. There's also an option in here to set up a 6-player round-robin tournament, and I don't know how really useful that is, but it's still cool that they included it. Along the same lines of the exhibition game, you can also play the All-Star game, and Sega even included the option to make custom rosters, just in case your favorite player didn't make the All-Star team in 1991, and you just want to squeeze them in. And then finally, there's the main game mode that most people will probably concentrate on, and that's the pennant race mode, which allows you to pick a team and play a full season of baseball, including playoffs, assuming you're good enough to make the playoffs with your team, of course. And I should probably clarify there that when I say full season, the game actually gives 4 season-length options up to 162 games, mirroring an actual MLB season. With season options potentially being that long, you might be wondering how save games are handled, and thankfully Sports Talk Baseball does include battery backup for game saves, so there's no messing around with passwords. However, there is one caveat, and that's that the game only gives you the option to save after the conclusion of a 3-game series against another team. So if you're planning on making some progress in pennant race mode, you're going to need to strap in to play at least 3 games. This isn't a huge deal, as your average game is probably only going to take you about 20 minutes to play, meaning that you only need to commit to about an hour per save game, but it is something to keep in mind, as you can't just simply save after every game like in other baseball titles. Pennant race mode is definitely an improvement over the season mode from Tommy Lasorda Baseball, but I've got to say, it feels like it's missing something. When games have to rely on password saves, it makes sense that the game isn't going to do any sort of stat tracking, because it would make any kind of password far too complex to keep up with. But since Sports Talk Baseball uses battery backup, it should be able to track all sorts of cool stats as the season progresses, right? Well, about that. Sports Talk Baseball presents as more of an arcade-styled baseball game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it also means that in-game stats are very lacking. There's no tracking of how players are doing during a game, with the exception of pitchers' stamina gauges. So you have no idea how many hits a player has, how many strikeouts, etc. Given the somewhat arcade nature of the game, that's somewhat forgivable, but when the scoreboard is presented in between innings, it literally only tracks the amount of runs scored. So if you're used to seeing at least collectively how many hits a team has, or if any errors were committed, well, you'll have to wait to the end of game wrap-up screen with the Sports Talk announcer, where at least home runs and strikeouts are tracked as well. But this seems like a huge miss. I'm not sure if I've ever seen another baseball game that doesn't keep up with anything besides run as the game progresses. and clearly they could since they're totaled up at the endgame screen. Just a very odd choice on Sega's part here. Having said that though, since stats aren't tracked in-game, they're definitely not tracked from the game to game. So as you go through pennant race mode, the only things that carry on from game to game throughout the season is the team's win-loss record and the current stamina of your pitchers, which keeps you from just throwing out your best starter every game and making the game at least somewhat realistic in that regard. With stats being such an integral part of any sport, much less baseball, it's disappointing to have a game that just totally disregards them completely. It's not the end of the world, but clearly Sega has left themselves something to improve on with their next baseball release. On a more positive note, Sports Talk Baseball plays very nicely, minus one annoying issue with the pitching. If you're familiar with any RBI baseball-styled game, you're going to be able to pick up and play Sports Talk Baseball right away, as the game features a very simple pitcher-batter interface, utilizing the traditional behind-the-umpire view of the plate. The pitcher picks their position on the mound, and then throws one of 4 pitches based on the direction of the D-pad, and then the batter either hits A to bunt or C to swing away. All seemingly fairly straightforward, but there's just one problem. What happens when you as a pitcher want to throw a breaking ball to the right or the left? Those pitches require you to hold either left or right on the D-pad and press C. However, holding left or right also moves the pitcher left or right on the mound. So if you're already positioned the pitcher where you want him, there's a good chance that he's going to move slightly as you try to throw one of those pitches, resulting in the ball not going where you want it to. Other games, such as the Hardball series, dealt with this by having the pitcher choose the pitch before throwing it, and it seems like Sports Talk Baseball could have done a better job here. Just one final note on the gameplay though, with the game's arcade nature, don't expect many strikeouts or walks. The ball is almost always going to be in play, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because the game's fielding interface works well, minus some noodle-armed outfielders and unusually slow base runners. But if you're more of a fan of simulation-style sports games, this certainly isn't going to help win you over with the previously mentioned lack of stats. From a graphical standpoint, Sports Talk Baseball isn't anything too special to look at, but I do think it comes across better than any other baseball game at the time on the console. The field interface tends to look a bit plain, and there's some odd slowdown at times depending on what sprites are on the screen, but the batter-pitcher interface looks sharp, as does most of the menus. This is one of those situations where it would have been nice to have custom stadiums included for each of the teams, because it would help the fields not look quite so plain. But again, I guess that's just another area that Sega could look to improve upon for their next baseball game. With a name like Sports Talk Baseball, as you can imagine, the sound in the game is going to be a focus, and I'd say the developers did a good job in delivering on that front. If you're familiar with the sports talk announcer from Sega's Joe Montana football series, this is going to sound very similar. So either you appreciate that somewhat robotic nature of the announcing, or you don't. And if you don't, Sega conveniently included an option to turn them off. I personally like it, considering the limitations of the time period and the fact that the game shipped on an 8 megabit cartridge, so it's not like they had an unlimited space for voice samples. I think perhaps my only complaint, and I feel like I noticed it more with Sports Talk Baseball than the football titles, is that sometimes the announcer will get, for lack of a better term, backed up, and his call of the action will run well after the plays are completed. It's not a big deal, mind you, but sometimes it's funny to hear him continue to talk well into the mid-inning break. Aside from the sports talk, there is bits of organ music here and there, and the sound effects used for the gameplay are fine, but clearly the focus was on the sports talk aspect of the game, so if you do turn it off, don't expect to be overly impressed with what's left. I mentioned earlier in the review that I had concerns that possibly my memories of the game were a bit rose-tinted. And after playing it this week, I think that's accurate, as I simply didn't remember some of the oddities, like the lack of stats, the clumsiness of the pitching interface, and the fact that they implemented the Little League 10-run domination rule for some reason, with no way to turn it off. But all that means is that the game isn't quite as awesome as I remember it. It's still quite good, and with the sports talk feature and real licensed players based on accurate stats, it's a landmark baseball title, not just on the Genesis, but on any console. Due to all that, I'm giving Sports Talk Baseball 3 stars. It's a very enjoyable title that does a lot of things correct, and one that I definitely recommend baseball fans at least give a try. And that's it for Sports Talk Baseball on the Genesis. I had a great time getting reacquainted with this game over the last week, and regardless of any fuzzy memories that I might have had about playing it, it was still very fun to play. And not just that, it was so easy to get into, and after a game or two, it was like no time had passed at all since I'd last played it, and I even feel like that I still had some of that same muscle memory that was coming back, as I wasn't struggling with what buttons to press when I needed to react quickly. Also, as much as I like this game, I remember liking its sequel, World Series Baseball, even better, so I'm excited to give that one a go as well, but that's a video for another time. Next time on the channel, well, I looked at the back of the schedule for the last month and a half or so, and somehow I've managed to review 5 Genesis games in a row, which seems a bit excessive, so we're going to shake things up a bit for next week. On the other hand, I've only reviewed 3 Sega CD games the whole year, and the last one, well, the less said about that one the better. So instead, I think I'm going to pick one that I've been curious about for years, that I first saw on the 3DO before realizing that there was a Sega CD version. I thought it looked mega cool being a fan of racing action games like Rock and Roll Racing, but it still relies on digital video in some places, so I'm not sure how well this version is going to hold up. We'll just have to see what Lance has in store for us. But that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 256. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.